It is the spring of 1220. On the borders of ancient Khwarezm, a mother stands helplessly, watching as soldiers drag her 14-year-old daughter toward a long caravan of prisoners. The girl's name is Zaria. She does not cry out, nor does she attempt to resist. She has already learned that defiance only sharpens the cruelty of her captors. Her name is already recorded in the ledgers of the Mongol army. Her age, her height, even the shape of her body, noted with the cold precision of an empire that was learning to catalogue human lives as though they were inventory. What was being done to girls like Zaria was not random, nor simply the result of soldiers' desires. It was part of a far larger project, one that went beyond the conquest of lands. This was about control, not only of territory, but of generations yet unborn. The bodies of women were being transformed into tools of empire. Motherhood twisted into an instrument of politics. You will not read about these details in the Grand Chronicles written to celebrate the Mongols' victories. Those accounts spoke of battles won, cities razed, rulers crushed. But hidden beneath those lines was another story, one that lived on not in parchment, but in bloodlines. Centuries later, genetic studies would reveal the staggering legacy of that policy, the unmistakable imprint of a system that turned reproduction into a weapon of state. The real strength of Genghis Khan was never just his battlefield genius. His power was measured in the legacy he engineered, one that reached into families, villages, and wombs. He built an empire not only with steel and fire, but with flesh. To understand how this dark system came into being, you must travel back before he was Genghis Khan, back to when he was only a poor boy named Temujin, born in 1162 among the harsh steppes of Mongolia. His tribe was weak, its survival constantly under threat from stronger, richer clans. Life was nothing but struggle, a perpetual fight for scraps. When Temujin was only 9, his father was murdered, likely poisoned by rival tribes. His mother, Hoylan, was abandoned with her young children, left to fend for themselves on an unforgiving land. They ate roots, scavenged fish from rivers, gnawed on bark, whatever kept them alive. From this brutal childhood, Temujin absorbed a cruel lesson. In this world there were only two kinds of people, those who took and those who were taken. At 16, tragedy struck again. His betrothed, Berte, was kidnapped by a rival clan. For months, Temujin searched for her, each rumor he heard more agonizing than the last. She had been forced into another man's bed, violated, enslaved. When he finally reclaimed her, Berta was pregnant. No one ever knew whose child she carried, Temujin's or that of her captors. But in that moment, something hardened within him. He came to a cold realization. Women were not just spoils of war, they were the vessels of the future. And whoever controlled women controlled the future. From then on, Temujin's strategy grew sharper, more chilling. While rival tribes grieved their dead or destroyed themselves in despair after losing battles, Temujin paid attention to the ones who endured. It was the women. They survived, they adapted, they gave birth. And their children grew up remembering who had taken their mothers. To Temujin, this was not a threat. It was an opportunity. If he could direct and regulate reproduction, he would not need to permanently occupy lands with soldiers. The conquered people themselves would, generation by generation, become Mongol. His empire would not just dominate the present, it would colonize the future. By the year 1206, when Temujin was crowned Genghis Khan, ruler of all the Mongol tribes, he had already shaped what his administrators would one day call the permanent breeding system. It was not theory, it was policy, and it had already begun. The first major trial of this system came in 1209 during the campaign against the Tanguts. The Mongols did not descend on cities as chaotic hordes as their enemies expected. They came with scribes, officials, and even physicians who specialized in women's bodies. Weeks before the main army arrived, spies had already infiltrated the cities, quietly conducting secret surveys. How many women? What were their ages, their physical traits, their family lineages? All of it written down on scrolls with chilling thoroughness. These would become the first industrial-scale records of systematic sexual enslavement in history. When the Tangut cities finally fell, The Mongols divided the population with merciless efficiency. The men were either executed or enslaved for labor. The women were classified. Category 1, ages 14 to 30, deemed prime for childbearing. Category 2, ages 31 to 40, women who had already proven fertile. Category 3, girls under 14, women over 40, the ill, the weak. The first two categories were marked with ink on their wrists and sent into caravans that followed the army. The third category simply vanished. These caravans were unlike anything the world had seen before. They were rolling cages designed not for goods, but for people, organized with compartments like breeding stalls. One section for newly captured women, another for those confirmed pregnant, another for those who had just given birth, and those who were deemed incapable of further childbearing were quietly eliminated. The system was horrifying, not only for its cruelty, but for its organization. Mongol physicians used herbs to stimulate ovulation, diets to enhance fertility, and even rudimentary surgeries to fix reproductive problems. Women were no longer seen as human beings, but as breeding stock, carefully maintained to maximize output. The empire kept records of conception rates, successful births, and reproductive efficiency per unit. What makes it most disturbing is not only what happened to these women, but how coldly it was tracked, tabulated, and filed away. And this was only the beginning. Because as the empire expanded, this system expanded with it. And what began in the Tangut cities would spread across Asia, leaving behind not just shattered families, but entire populations reshaped by force. Every assault was noted, every pregnancy carefully logged, every birth classified by officials who decided whether a child would be raised as Mongol or erased from existence. The Mongol administrators had devised a system of numbers tattooed on the wrists of women. Those markings recorded their identity, origin, reproductive record, and estimated value. A name was no longer necessary. From the moment of capture, each woman ceased to be a person. She became a number, a piece of data in an empire that had reduced human identity to administrative code. Some women fought to keep fragments of themselves alive. A few whispered their true names to their children, hoping that someone somewhere might remember. Others cut scars into their own flesh, crude memorials etched into skin to say, "I existed. I was more than this." But the machinery was relentless. Within a single generation, tens of thousands of women had become shadows of their former selves, stripped of name, voice, and lineage. By the year 1211, when Genghis Khan set his sights on the mighty Jin Empire, the system was no longer an experiment. It was perfected. The Mongols did not merely conquer territory, they conquered wombs. Chinese records from the campaign are chilling. In one city alone, Zhongdu, more than 40,000 women of childbearing age were seized. Accounts describe over 100,000 women, divided into specialized caravans that stretched for miles behind the advancing armies. No longer were women abducted in isolated acts of war. Each caravan was designed like a factory of flesh. The divisions were clear: capture, selection, acclimatization, a cruel euphemism for the routine assaults that broke resistance, followed by pregnancy, childbirth, and eventual reassignment. Every birth led to another judgment. Infants who bore enough Mongol traits were separated from their mothers and raised by Mongol families. Those who did not pass the inspection were simply removed. Their existence ended before it began. The Mongols had written protocols for every form of defiance. A woman who refused to eat was force-fed until she surrendered the idea that her body was her own. If one attempted to miscarry, she was placed under constant surveillance, sometimes even bound during her final months. Those who scarred or mutilated themselves to prevent pregnancy were kept alive long enough to be displayed, living warnings to the others. Mothers who dared to smother their newborns rather than see them raised by strangers endured public torture, transforming an act of compassion into a performance of terror. Through this, Genghis Khan achieved something far more sinister than ordinary conquest. He was not satisfied with cities that could one day rise again in rebellion. He sought to seize the very bloodlines of conquered peoples. Rape was elevated to state policy, and motherhood was twisted into a tool of empire. Each pregnant woman in the caravans was no longer just a captive. She was a seed of conquest planted for generations to come. Chinese and Persian archives preserve fragments of these records, and what they reveal is staggering. By 1220, the caravans contained over 200,000 women, spread along routes stretching from Mongolia all the way to Eastern Europe. A vast logistical web existed solely for their transport and management. There were supply stations where women were inspected like livestock, field hospitals dedicated to forced births, and sorting centers where the fate of each child was determined. This was not chaos, this was design. The true horror lay not only in the violence itself, but in the precision with which it was administered. Genghis Khan had bureaucratized cruelty. His scribes wrote down assaults with the same attention they gave to inventories of cattle. His physicians experimented on female bodies with the same dispassion as they devised strategies for siege warfare. His administrators calculated fertility rates with the same precision they used to count silver and gold taken from defeated cities. And yet, even inside this machinery, the women fought back in ways no scribe could fully capture. They created silent codes, a flick of a hand, a shift in posture to warn of planned escapes, hidden abortive practices, or secret poisons. Some nursed their babies with tainted milk, so the infants would die quietly, leaving no trace. Others learned to vomit food discreetly, starving themselves slowly until they became too weak to carry a pregnancy to term. There were those who deliberately wounded themselves, infecting cuts, so that fevers would complicate reproduction. But the deepest resistance was not physical, it was emotional. Mothers invented rituals to remember the names of the children taken from them. Women whispered fragments of songs from their villages, carrying scraps of culture into the silence of the night. They could not stop their own suffering, but they tried to ensure that some trace of who they had been would outlast the caravans. Still, the system evolved. By 1219, when Genghis Khan turned against the Khwarezmian Empire, the machinery of reproduction reached its most refined form. The Mongols no longer relied on improvisation. They had perfected protocols for every type of resistance, every type of city, every type of culture. Their intelligence networks grew sophisticated, cataloging not only women but their families, their talents, even their emotional bonds. This information was weaponized, used to break captives more efficiently, to isolate them, to make them easier to process. The Khwarezmian cities faced not just soldiers and siege weapons, but an invisible system they had never imagined, an empire that could conquer not only bodies but bloodlines, and the nightmare was far from over. Because what awaited the Khwarezmians was the most brutal expression of this system yet, a campaign where no resistance, no culture, no identity would be allowed to survive untouched. The Mongols did not march simply to loot. They came to harvest. In cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, and Merv, women were separated from their families with ruthless precision. The invaders had learned something chilling. If mothers were kept with their children in the first weeks, they resisted less. But once 3 months had passed, tearing them apart broke their spirit forever. The system grew so refined that it even distinguished between social classes. Noble women were not spared. They received what was called special treatment, which meant being violated by high-ranking officers and confined to slightly more comfortable tents. It was not kindness, it was calculation. The Mongols observed that children born of noble women often possessed traits seen as finer, making them easier to weave into the aristocracy. Peasant women were processed in mass numbers, their value measured not in lineage but in stamina. How well their bodies could endure repeated pregnancies under brutal conditions. Mongolian doctors advanced sinister methods to make those wombs more productive. They crafted herbal concoctions that could trigger multiple ovulations, increasing the chance of twins or even triplets. They identified pregnancies early, adjusting diets to minimize miscarriages and accelerate childbirth. Every technique served a single goal: to turn each captured body into an efficient reproductive unit, a factory of future subjects. By 1220, the machinery had grown beyond comprehension. Caravans of women stretched for days, moving like endless rivers of human misery behind the Mongol armies. These were not random prisoners. They were organized with military precision. Each caravan had specialized divisions: capture, sorting, acclimatization, early pregnancy, late pregnancy, delivery, postnatal care, reassignment, or disposal. Each division was run by officials, healers, guards, and scribes who ensured that no part of the cycle was left to chance. The caravans traveled with their own infrastructure: wagons outfitted as makeshift hospitals, prison tents for different stages of pregnancy, and even morgue wagons to dispose of women who died during processing. They were mobile cities of horror, trailing the armies like a shadow no one could escape. The brilliance of the system, if such evil can be called brilliant, was not only its efficiency, but its permanence. Genghis Khan had recognized the truth most conquerors ignored. Plunder ends. Kingdoms fall, but genetics endure. A raid might be temporary. A bloodline could last forever. Every child born from these caravans carried the genetic mark of conquest, and those children would one day have children of their own. Victory in this sense was eternal. Modern science has confirmed this chilling reality. Genetic studies reveal that around 16 million men alive today are direct descendants of Genghis Khan and his immediate male line. That equates to roughly 1 in every 200 men on Earth. In Mongolia, the percentage is even higher, about 8%. In parts of Central Asia, it lingers around 3%. And in Eastern Europe, though the Mongol presence was briefer, their genetic fingerprints remain, but the statistics tell only part of the story. This system did not end with Genghis Khan himself. His heirs carried it forward. His successor, Ögedei Khan, refined the methods during the European campaigns. Mungke Khan applied them when the Mongols struck the Abbasid Caliphate, and Kublai Khan, who would rule in China, continued the policies on an even broader scale. What began as a weapon of conquest had become imperial doctrine, a dynastic tradition passed from one generation to the next. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227 during the campaign against the Tanguts, caravans of captive women stretched thousands of miles across Eurasia. His passing did not dismantle the system. Instead, his heirs treated it as a sacred inheritance. The women were divided among Mongol princes as hereditary property. Their children raised to carry on the expansion. The system had become so embedded in Mongol rule that it functioned like a manual for empire. Even in death, Genghis Khan's shadow consumed women's lives. His funeral rites were said to include the slaughter of 40 maidens buried alive with his body. Yet this public sacrifice was only the surface. The true funerary offering was far larger. Thousands of caravan women executed to prevent escape during the fragile transition of power. Their corpses filled mass graves, buried with the same cold bureaucracy that had defined their lives. Archaeologists have begun to uncover these graves. The evidence matches the records. Burial pits filled with young women lie apart from the warrior tombs. Their bones bear scars of starvation, untreated fractures, and the physical toll of forced marches. Among them lie the remains of infants and small children, tossed aside without the rituals normally given to Mongol dead. One excavation near ancient Bukhara unearthed a haunting scene: the skeletons of an adult woman and a teenage girl buried side by side. DNA tests proved they were mother and daughter. Isotope analysis revealed something even more tragic. The mother had been local to the region, but the daughter had traveled vast distances before her death. Proof of the endless forced relocations that defined the caravans. The grave, silent for centuries, speaks louder than any chronicle. It carries us back to the beginning of the story, to that mother who watched her young daughter marched into captivity. Across the centuries, the pattern repeats: mothers and daughters torn from their homes, stripped of names, reduced to numbers in a ledger of empire. And it reminds us of the darkest truth. The power of Genghis Khan did not end with his armies. It lived on in the bodies of women, in the children born of violence, in the bloodlines scattered across continents. His empire was not only written in stone, steel, and fire, but inscribed in flesh. That is why his legacy is still with us, not only in history books, not only in monuments, but in the very DNA of millions alive today. What Genghis Khan did to enemy wives was not just a crime of his time, it was a conquest of generations, one that still haunts the living world.